There are a few games that can match the reputation of Dwarf Fortress. First released in 2006, this fantasy colony sim has been continuously updated and is still years away from being finished. In that time, it's grown to be something of a legend in the online world. It's spawned countless stories and memes that have gone on to be shared so much that they almost represent a form of entertainment in themselves, and it's regularly been called the most complicated or difficult game ever made. A lot of people have heard of this game, but it seems like few go on to actually play it themselves, and I think the reputation that's been constructed around it has sometimes turned people away from actually playing it. Where other games like Dark Souls have wielded their hardcore reputations to great effect, even incorporating it into their marketing, I don't think that's really happened with Dwarf Fortress. Maybe it's how the game looks. Graphics are a big part of what draws us to new games after all. Or maybe it's the lack of a marketing department or budget in a place to spin things the right way. But regardless of the reason, it's a shame, because this is a game that more people should play, and I'm not sure its reputation is always that accurate. The first article to come up in a Google search describes it as a punishing game for people who like to be frustrated. The community motto of "losing is fun" is regularly used to imply losing is something that happens often, but this is only true in the sense that the game has no win condition. The most common way for a fortress to end is from a player retiring it. This doesn't mean the fortress dies, it just means it continues running without your direct supervision, which doesn't seem like losing. Disasters can happen, and they might prompt you to start over, but they rarely completely wipe your fortress out. When you're new to the game, you might start over a lot as you learn more about the game, but even then, that doesn't really seem like losing. Really, this isn't a game about winning or losing, but "losing is fun" is a fitting motto for understanding the philosophy behind enjoying the game. You see, in Dwarf Fortress, you can't manually save. You can't rewind time and undo mistakes. You live with the consequences of your actions, and so you need to accept that. Bad things can happen, but they don't happen to punish or frustrate the player. They happen to make things interesting, and the fact that their consequences are permanent is why they're so successful. Events that are permanent are made meaningful, and that's why the stories this game generates are so good. But in many ways, the game's design is deliberately not very punishing. In fact, Dwarf Fortress can feel very relaxing. And it seems wrong to describe it as a hardcore game because none of the appeal is about the challenge, and once you learn the basics, the challenge is usually quite small unless you want it to be bigger. The learning curve is real, but I'll get to that. Dwarf Fortress is complicated, but not impossibly so. It's difficult to learn, but not really difficult to play. Things can go wrong, but it's not a game about things going wrong. Crazy things could occur in your game, but that's not guaranteed, and describing it as a game about the funny stories you'll eventually tell sells it short because Dwarf Fortress is more than that. It's a game about simulating a fantasy world, a world with a history, with its own legends and civilizations, a world where you play a small but not insignificant part by taking charge of a new settlement that you build from scratch. You oversee your dwarves by assigning which jobs each dwarf will do, and then designating things that need doing in the fortress. You'll start small but can end up with well over 100 dwarves. You can set up industries, craft, mine, trade, build almost anything, and wage war with your neighbours. And as you do, you'll create your own piece of history. You'll leave a mark on the world, and even if your fortress does die or you retire, that mark will remain. The world will still be there, and you can jump back in whenever you want. Dwarf Fortress is a very different game to most. It prioritises the simulation over the game by featuring an unprecedented level of detail, often for the sake of realism, not gameplay. There's a philosophy behind this game that you won't see anywhere else, and it asks lots of interesting hypothetical questions. What could be achieved if graphics didn't matter? What if a game has no win condition, or any other objective for the player? What if game development was a continual process rather than a race to the finish line? These are questions worth asking, but Dwarf Fortress is also fun. I want to talk more about why you should play it, but before that I want to do my best to help break down the initial barrier of accessibility that I think puts people off. Getting Dwarf Fortress running isn't difficult. The game is completely free. You can just go to the developer's website to download it, but you should make sure to download the starter pack. I'll include a link in the description, but it's important to download the starter pack rather than the base game because it comes with all the major add-ons, tile sets, and an easy to use options menu already included. Once you've downloaded it, you just unzip the file and run the launcher. Here you'll see a number of options, but for now you can just leave everything as it is. In the next tab is tile sets, which you can try out and see how they look yourself. ASCII is the default option. It represents things through different letters and symbols, and this is what most people think of when they think Dwarf Fortress. If you're a strong, independent gamer who don't need no graphics, ASCII might be the perfect choice. Once you're familiar with it, ASCII offers good visual clarity and it has a certain old school charm. You can also get together with other ASCII users and talk about what plebs other people are for needing something as primitive as graphics to play a game. Still, for most people, you'll want to select a tile set. Phoebus is perhaps the most commonly used. It looks like this and it's pretty good for new players. Personally though, I like to use Space Fox. It has a more cartoony aesthetic, which may be off-putting to some, but the sprites do look good. Some people view Space Fox's cartooniness as heresy, but to them I say, look at these cats and dogs. Now those are some pretty cute little sprites there. Almost makes you feel bad when you go on a puppy slaughtering spree to harvest some sweet, supple puppy leather. But anyway, choose what appeals to you, you can always change it later. The Utilities tab is also important. Most things are optional and do something specific unrelated to the main game. Dwarf Therapist is a must though. When a game's running, it looks like this. So like a big spreadsheet that lists all of your dwarves and each job that can be assigned. You can just click a box to assign or remove each job, and there's lots of other information here, also in an easy to understand format. It might look intimidating, but it's easy to use and very important for new players. Sound Sense might also be worth using. It includes some sound effects and music, but other things in the Utilities tab you won't want to worry about until later. Once you launch the game, the first thing you need to do is create your world. Consider turning the size and history down to small and short if you want to speed this process up, and then sit back and watch your creation come to life. The world will be procedurally generated, first with basic elements like elevation, rainfall and mineral distribution, then with animal and monster populations, as well as civilizations and strongholds. Once the world's populated, it will begin simulating its history year by year. Settlements will be created and destroyed, wars will be waged, religions founded, artifacts crafted, and every death and birth will be recorded. We haven't even got in game yet, and already the level of detail is impressive. But don't worry too much about understanding it all just yet. You can appreciate it at a later date. Back at the main menu, you can start a game now. Choose your world and choose Dwarf Fortress, and then you have to select the site you found your fortress at. The site you choose matters a lot. In many ways, site selection is a bit like the difficulty menu. Some things make your life harder and some things easier. You can also use a search option to find sites with specific properties. There's a lot to consider, but for your first fortress you'll just be focused on learning the game, and you'll likely start over fairly quickly anyway, so make sure not to obsess over this choice. When done, choose to embark and play now, and you'll be in game. You may already be thinking things have got pretty complicated, and that's understandable, but while Dwarf Fortress has a lot to learn, there are also great resources available to make that process easier. The best of which is the Dwarf Fortress Wiki. It's full of information, but it's still easy to use and easy to understand. On that wiki there's a quick start guide that can walk you through all the first steps to getting your fortress up and running. I won't try and turn this video into a tutorial as several already exist, but I will say a word of advice. Don't worry about needing to learn everything straight away. Take it slow, focus on one thing at a time and refer back to the wiki when you have questions. It's not an easy game to learn, but it may not be as bad as you think, as long as you don't let it overwhelm you. Still, there are two big problems you need to overcome. The first is getting your head around how it looks. You'll notice that the world is divided up into squares, except it's not. The world is actually made up of cubes, like say Minecraft, which actually took inspiration from Dwarf Fortress. So the world is cubes and you only see one layer at a time. You can move up and down the Z-axis to see each layer as a sort of cross-section. This can be difficult to get your head around, but I think the best way to illustrate it is with trees. On the ground level you'll see the tree stumps, and as you move up you'll see the branches and leaves. You can still see parts of the ground because you see through empty space, and hopefully by seeing how trees appear in the world you can start to visualize how space and objects are represented. To find out what a square is, you can click it and a description will appear in the top right. Later on you'll be familiar with what different things look like, but initially you'll probably find yourself doing this a lot. When you don't have something selected, the top right will display a menu of different actions you can do, and this is where we get to the second big problem for new players, the UI. In the words of Tarn Adams, the main developer behind the game,
so they have to navigate the interface. This is a difficult thing because the interface is terrible.
There's three main problems with the UI. Firstly, you can't use the mouse to navigate menus. You can use the mouse to select things in the world and designate certain actions, but menus need to be navigated by keybinds. Which leads to the second problem. Menus are quite large and there are menus within menus, which means lots of keybinds. Until you've memorized them, you'll have to look at the menu, find the option you want, and then press the button next to it on your keyboard. In a big menu, that's slow, and when you have to go through multiple menus, it gets even slower. It's a bit like learning to touch type. When you don't have to look, it can be quick to use, but until you get to that stage, it's pretty clunky. The final problem with the UI is it can be inconsistent. Take scrolling through lists. A lot of lists you'll scroll through with the arrow keys, except some lists you have to use plus and minus to navigate them. There's a logic behind that, but you might not realise it at first and find yourself using the wrong keys. Some lists also use the number keys, which can allow you to navigate them faster than one at a time, but some things that use the number keys will also use the arrow keys, which could be easier to use, except the game doesn't tell you this because it only shows you one keybind, so if you can use multiple things, only one will be listed on screen. Oh, and there are a couple of times when you actually can use your mouse, just to remind you what a luxury mouse control can be. So there's 4 different ways to navigate lists that work in different scenarios. Having one universal way would be a lot simpler, particularly for new players. There's also plenty of times when similar things are done in different ways. Want to make a storeroom? Create a stockpile inside the room. Want to make a meeting hall? Create a zone and designate it as a meeting area. Want to make a farm? Build a farm where you want it. Want to make a bedroom? Craft a bed, then build it, then query it. Similar things can be done in completely different ways, which is not a problem when you're used to it, but it is a problem when you're learning. Again, there's logic to why these things are the way they are, but that logic won't always be obvious to the player, and common sense only gets you so far with the UI. Some things are hidden in places you wouldn't expect them, and some activities have an extra step that's easy to miss, and lessons learnt from one thing don't always apply to similar things. This is where a lot of the frustration comes from for new players. Even if you know what you want to do, knowing how to do it can still be a problem. But that's where the wiki comes in. It has all the answers, and combined with a bit of patience, you will get the hang of things if you just persevere. Also, criticising the UI is valid, but you should understand that the UI is the way it is in part because of the game's continuous development. New features are added over time, so things don't always work the exact same way. You can say the game needs a complete UI redesign, but doing so would take up a lot of time that would otherwise be spent creating new features, and as development would still be ongoing, the new features that continue to be added may cause new problems anyway. So the initial problem of understanding the graphics and using the UI are problems, but you can overcome them quicker than you might think. There will still be a lot to learn, but it's not true that you need to learn everything before you'll start enjoying the game. In fact, learning as you go can be a lot of fun. You'll set yourself small goals and then learn how to complete them, and the process can feel very rewarding. You'll see your fortress come to life, and at the same time you'll feel your understanding of the game grow. There's a magic to that period, where you've got over the initial graphical and UI hurdles and are constantly learning new things and making real progress. It's a period where you're learning just how deep the depth of the game really can be, and where you don't know what to expect. There is another real problem with the game for experienced players, however: difficulty. You see, currently Dwarf Fortress is an easy game, and balance is a problem. Just as with the UI, this criticism needs to be considered alongside the fact that Dwarf Fortress is in alpha. It says as much when you create a game. No one can expect something in alpha to be perfectly balanced, and if the game needed to be, development would be considerably slower. However, there are a few things that are real issues, and even take away from the simulation aspect of the experience. Firstly, defending your fortress is too easy, because nearly all enemies can't overcome retractable bridges. Cage traps are also overpowered, which can lead to some silly results, like when you catch a fire-breathing dragon in a wooden cage. Outside of defense, making crafts is too profitable, and trading is too generous, and there's not enough real incentive to diversify your economy, even if the game gives you loads of ways to do so. Small farms also provide too much food, and there's no real penalty for dwarves eating only one type of food. One relatively small plump helmet farm can take care of a huge fortress's entire food and drink supply. It's ridiculous. Also, cats and dogs don't eat food, although they can be food, which makes breeding them too effective. Dwarves are also too productive. It might be necessary early in the game because otherwise getting the fortress going would be too time consuming, but later it's hard to even find jobs for your dwarves as everything gets done so quickly. One part-time chef can cook lavish meals for 150 dwarves easily, which doesn't make sense. But it's also a problem because dwarves will be idle all the time. Productivity needs to be better balanced, so there's more late game tasks that are time consuming, and dwarves are also too happy, particularly when they never do any work. Once upon a time, dwarves may have been too unhappy, leading to snowballing situations, but it's gone too far in the other direction. These aren't the only balance problems, but they are some of the things that can make the game side of Dwarf Fortress too easy. There's no incentive or reward for trying to create an efficient, well-running fortress, and there should be. However, it also needs to be said Dwarf Fortress does allow you to create your own challenge. This can be by choosing a difficult starting site, like next to a necromancer's tower or somewhere with no wood or vegetation, or worse, an aquifer. It can also be setting yourself challenges and goals in-game, like by creating great feats of engineering, such as cascading waterfalls running through your fortress or moats of lava. You can do some very impressive things in Dwarf Fortress, and you can certainly create your own challenges. Dwarf Fortress is very rewarding for those who are creative, but for an experienced player that wants the game to have some difficulty, you will have to create it yourself, which is something that appeals to some players more than others, and better balance of certain things could improve Dwarf Fortress as a game as well as a simulation, so it should perhaps be a bigger focus. But even if balance is bad and running a fortress can be too easy, there is still a certain amount of enjoyment from the problem-solving aspect of the game. Apart from assigning jobs in Dwarf Therapist, designating tasks, and actually designing your fortress, that's what the rest of the gameplay is really about. You don't control your dwarves directly, so if you want something done and it doesn't happen, you have to ask yourself why. In a recent game I needed wood, but the trees I designated to be chopped down were being left up. I knew I had axes, and I knew I had several dwarves assigned to wood chopping, but it turned out I had too many assigned, and the dwarves who had the axes were busy doing other jobs with a higher priority, while the dwarves without axes sat around complaining and getting drunk. Easy to fix, craft more axes, but it's usually not enough to notice a problem, you have to troubleshoot why it's happening. Another time I got a message that a dwarf was dehydrated, so I search for the dwarf and go to his location, and he's at the top of a tree. Not sure why or how he got up there, but no good can come from a dwarf in a tree, so I decided to rescue him. I could chop the tree down, which would be the quickest solution, but that would risk injury. So after thinking a bit, I decided to do what dwarves do so well: build. I set about building a stone stairway up to him so he could get down. But as I was waiting for my other dwarves to get the rescue mission underway, the dwarf up the tree jumped down. Or maybe he fell, I'm not sure. I still don't know how he got up there, but I'll be keeping an eye on that dwarf in the future, because you just can't trust a dwarf that gets stuck in a tree. It is nice to know though that after hundreds of hours of game time, there are still things that happen which surprise me, and which prompt me to think a bit about how to do something. There are so many moving parts in this game, so many systems taking place under the surface, so much detail, so many variables. I've seen my share of crazy things as well. I've dealt with vampire infections, seen catastrophic feats of failed engineering, and killed megabeasts in a single hit. I've dug too deep and seen things no dwarf is meant to see. I've settled too close to a goblin stronghold and endured non-stop war, only to have a necromancer turn up and teach me why you should always bury the dead. I've seen some real madness, but I don't think that's what makes me so impressed with the game. It's the level of simulation that impresses me. In Dwarf Fortress, the combat log is a complete mess. In a big battle, it will generate hundreds and hundreds of pages of text detailing exactly what happens between each character, and it's so dense that no one would ever read it all. But in that mess of text is every single event, every single attack, every miss, every hit, every consequence, every bruised thumb or cracked tooth. There's nothing else quite like it. A dwarf's personality is made up of over 30 traits, each with a score between 0 and 100, which make the dwarf who they are. Every single positive or negative event that ever happens to a dwarf, from seeing a well-crafted piece of furniture to hearing an annoying noise, is all recorded and used to calculate their level of stress. As you progress through your fortress's lifespan, the world keeps moving around you. Other civilizations will continue to grow and fight. And ever since update 44, you can now interact with the outside world in a meaningful way. You can send out armies to pillage or raise other settlements, and you can wage wars and win them. The system is still quite basic, but it's a great start that fits perfectly into the idea that this isn't about your dwarves or your fortress, it's about the world. That you are a part of history that will keep going even if you die and your fortress falls to ruin. Some of the details in this game really don't have a big effect. There's 40 different types of stone and 129 types of gems. Each has a different value, melting point, boiling point, and density, all based off real-life geology. These differences will have very little impact on gameplay, but they exist, and in the right situation they just might matter. You usually won't bother to look through each combat log, but you could. With over 100 dwarves, you aren't going to care about each of their personalities, but those personalities are still there, even if you don't care. All of the insane amount of detail that make up this game may not have a huge impact on gameplay, and a lot of it can and will be something you just ignore most of the time, but it still exists, and that matters. And even if it doesn't add to the gameplay, it does add to the simulation. The fact that all of the details are there is enough to add so much meaning to what happens. That's why this game spawns so many stories. It's not because what happens is so crazy, it's because there's enough detail to make it believable, with enough variables to create surprises. That's what makes Dwarf Fortress so great. And it's only possible because the graphics are what they are. Dwarf Fortress could never be what it is otherwise. I remember listening to Tarn Adams speak once, and he said imagine what would have happened if the game industry never cared about graphics. What direction would games have gone in? What kind of games would have ended up being produced? It's an interesting thing to think about, but of course, the games industry does care about graphics. In fact, it cares about them a lot. When it comes to sales, nothing is more important. The AAA market is in a ruthless competition to constantly push the boundaries of what's graphically possible. Huge amounts of money and manpower are invested for ever diminishing incremental increases in graphical technology. Good-looking games that are perceived as being even slightly behind the curve are crucified for their shortcomings. Past games that were once setting new standards can feel outdated in a matter of years, and the latest hot thing will spawn hundreds of news articles praising minuscule features like dynamically changing horse testicles. Just because this is apparently what progress looks like. This is how we know the future is here. At the same time, all those who can't compete are pushed further away. Sure, some indie games become incredible successes despite being graphically behind, but they're the exception, not the rule. For every one indie game that makes it big, there are thousands that will release without receiving the slightest bit of attention. Because to get noticed, you need your game to look good, and for that, you need money, but to get money, you need to get noticed. It's a cycle that plenty of creative, passionate, and talented developers will never break into. And as the standards for graphics move ever upwards, the difficult task of getting people to give your low-budget game a chance only becomes harder and harder. Meanwhile, as the cost of making AAA games increases, the companies behind these titles become less and less willing to take risks. The cost of failure becomes too high, so they stick with what they know, reproducing things proven to be successful, looking to market testing to find out what has the broadest appeal, and implementing a design-by-committee approach that prioritizes commercial viability over artistic integrity and originality. And I'm not trying to criticize the game industry. Not really. I'm also not saying people are wrong for caring about graphics. I'm just saying graphics do matter. A lot. And that comes with some drawbacks. But then there's Dwarf Fortress. A game that looks like this. A game that breaks all the rules and rejects all conventional wisdom. A game which by default doesn't even have graphics, but because of this it's able to include so many other things and offer a level of simulation that's unmatched. The UI is terrible, and even with years of development, improving it has never seemed like a priority. Rather than being designed by a committee, the game is designed by two brothers who only care about their own vision. It was funded purely by donations, and the only marketing it's had has been from word of mouth from fans, which it turns out has nevertheless carried it pretty far. And you know what? A lot of these graphically impressive games won't leave very long-lasting legacies. As technology improves, they'll be chewed up and spat out by the very same thing that made them successful, as the cutting edge of gaming graphics that they once rode to success moves on and leaves them behind. But Dwarf Fortress won't. Its legacy will live on, because it's a legacy built on something very different to most other games, and with much sturdier foundations. It's a true magnum opus, the result of a lifetime of work by its creators that may never be truly finished. It's hugely flawed, but also truly unique, and an experience unlike any other. And if you've never played it, you should. Not because it adds to your gaming credibility or just so that you can share wacky stories, but because it's a genuinely important game. In a lot of ways, Dwarf Fortress is the antithesis to the modern AAA gaming market. It has a philosophy and priority system behind it that are different to anything else, and it asks questions that really matter. About what a game should be, what should it focus on, what can it achieve. Dwarf Fortress is like some crazy experiment, and I'm not sure exactly what the point of the experiment is. But whatever it is without a shadow of a doubt, a huge success.